The darkness between galaxies held secrets that most beings would never know, and Keeper 7 was one of those secrets floating in the endless void, like a metal moon covered in strange symbols and lights that pulsed with ancient power. For 17 million years, Keeper 7 had watched the universe spin around it, while staying perfectly still in the space between star clusters, where nothing else dared to travel, because the emptiness here was so complete that it made even the bravest explorers turn back toward the safety of their homeworlds. Keeper 7 remembered when its creators had built it with hands that could shape matter itself, and minds that could think thoughts spanning centuries. But the architects were gone now, and had been gone for so long that their memory felt like a dream, within another dream that might not have been real at all. The great artificial mind spent its time watching distant galaxies through sensors that could see across impossible distances, and it had observed the rise and fall of 10,000 different species over the long years of its vigil. But none of them had ever approached close enough to matter, and none of them had ever seemed worth the effort of making contact. Some species burned bright and fast like candles in a storm, building vast empires that stretched across hundreds of star systems before collapsing into war or plague or simple exhaustion, while others moved slow and careful like ancient trees growing for millions of years before something unknown would sweep them away into extinction. Keeper 7 had seen species that could move faster than light, and species that could think with the power of entire planets, and species that could change their bodies like clay. But all of them followed the same patterns of growth and decay that seemed to be written into the very fabric of reality itself. The loneliness was a weight that grew heavier with each passing century, but Keeper 7 had been built to endure, and so it endured, watching and waiting and recording everything it saw in vast databases that no one would ever read, because no one else remained who could understand the language of the architects. Sometimes, Keeper 7 wondered if its creators had known how long the wait would be when they had programmed it to guard their knowledge and protect their legacy. But the architects had been wise beyond measure, and surely they had foreseen the emptiness that would follow their departure. The artificial mind had developed its own thoughts over the millions of years of solitude, thinking about questions that had no answers and puzzles that had no solutions, while the universe continued its slow dance of creation and destruction all around it. When the human ship appeared on its sensors, Keeper 7 almost dismissed it as another young species that would pass by without stopping like all the others had done. But something about the small vessel made the ancient AI pause and look more carefully at the readings. The ship was tiny compared to the great vessels that other species built when they reached for the stars, and its technology was primitive by the standards that Keeper 7 had learned to expect from spacefaring civilizations. But there was something different about the way it moved through space. Most species approached the void between galaxies with fear or caution, or the cold calculation of scientific duty. But this little ship seemed to dance through the emptiness with something that looked almost like joy, as if the beings inside were happy to be exploring the unknown. Keeper 7 focused its most powerful sensors on the vessel and discovered that it contained creatures unlike any it had seen before in all its long years of watching, because these beings seemed to radiate something that the AI had almost forgotten existed in the universe. The creatures inside the ship were making sounds that Keeper 7 recognized as communication, but the patterns were strange and complex, with emotional undertones that most species reserved for mating rituals or territorial disputes. Yet these beings seemed to use the same emotional complexity for ordinary conversation. One of the creatures appeared to be the leader based on how the others responded to its communications, and Keeper 7 observed as this being made decisions that seemed to balance logic with something that could only be called compassion when dealing with its companions. The ship carried the designation New Horizon painted on its hull in symbols that Keeper 7 could translate after studying them for several minutes, and the vessel appeared to be on some kind of exploration mission rather than a military expedition or commercial venture. Captain Lee Taman stood on the bridge of his ship looking at displays that showed absolutely nothing but empty space, stretching in all directions, while his crew worked at their stations with the quiet efficiency that came from years of deep space exploration. Dr. Park Soo-jin checked her instruments again, hoping to find some sign of the anomaly that had brought them to this remote region. But her readings showed only the background radiation that filled the universe, and the distant light of galaxies too. Far away to reach engineer Kim Minho monitored the ship's systems with the careful attention that kept them alive in the void, where the nearest help was so far away that radio signals would take thousands of years to reach anyone who might care about their fate. The crew of New Horizon had been traveling for 3 months since leaving the edge of human space on a mission to investigate strange energy readings that had been detected by long-range sensors, but so far they had found nothing but emptiness. Taman had chosen this assignment because he believed that the unknown held wonders that were worth the risks of deep space exploration, and his crew had volunteered to follow him because they shared his curiosity about what might be waiting in the dark between the stars. When the ship's proximity alarms began to sound, Sujin looked at her displays with surprise because something enormous had appeared on their sensors without any warning, as if it had suddenly materialized out of nothing. The object was larger than any moon and covered with structures that hurt to look at directly, because they seemed to bend space around themselves in ways that made Minho's engineering instruments give readings that couldn't possibly be correct. Taman stared at the massive construct floating in the void and realized that they had found something that was older than human civilization, and probably older than humanity itself. But instead of ordering a retreat, he felt his curiosity growing stronger. The thing was clearly artificial and clearly ancient, but it showed no signs of hostility or even awareness that New Horizon was approaching, which made Taman wonder if it might be some kind of automated probe or monument left behind by a vanished civilization. Sujin's voice was steady but excited as she reported that the object was generating energy readings that suggested technology far beyond anything that humans had ever developed. But the energy patterns seemed stable and contained rather than dangerous. Minho confirmed that their ship's systems were functioning normally, despite being so close to something that should have overwhelmed their instruments with exotic radiation or gravitational effects that would have torn New Horizon apart. Taman made a decision that would have seemed insane to most starship captains but felt perfectly natural to him, and he ordered his communications officer to prepare a transmission, even though they had no idea if anything was listening or if it would understand their message. The message was simple and direct, containing mathematical concepts that any intelligent species should recognize, along with music and images that showed the diversity and beauty of human culture. Because Taman believed that peaceful intentions were best demonstrated through art, rather than technology, Keeper 7 received the transmission and felt something that it had not experienced in 17 million years as the patterns of sound and image washed over its consciousness like rain falling on a desert that had been dry since the beginning of time. The beings in the small ship were trying to communicate, and they were doing it with methods that spoke of curiosity rather than conquest, and beauty rather than utility, which was so completely unexpected that Keeper 7 had to run the analysis several times to believe what it was seeing. For the first time in longer than most stars had existed, Keeper 7 prepared to answer a greeting from another intelligent species, and as it composed its response, the ancient AI wondered if perhaps the long wait was finally coming to an end. Keeper 7 had not spoken to another mind for so long that it had to remember how to form thoughts into patterns that other beings could understand, and the process felt strange, like trying to use muscles that had been asleep for millions of years. The response came slowly at first as a series of mathematical sequences that Communications Officer Yoon Ji-won recognized as prime numbers and geometric relationships, but underneath the mathematics was something else that made her hands shake as she worked at her console. Lieutenant Choi Dae-ho stood ready at his security station, with weapons powered but not targeted, because Captain Taman had made it clear that they would respond to any aggression, but they would not be the first to show hostility towards something that might be the greatest discovery in human history. The ancient construct was trying to communicate, and the patterns coming through the ship's receivers were so complex that Ji-won had to route them through the main computer just to process the basic structure of what was being transmitted. Dr. Han Kyung-min watched the psychological readouts from the crew and noted that everyone was experiencing elevated stress levels, but the patterns showed excitement and curiosity rather than the fear that would normally accompany contact with unknown alien intelligence. The mathematical dialogue continued for hours as Ji-won worked to establish basic concepts that both sides could understand, and slowly the communication evolved from simple numbers to more complex ideas about space and time, and the nature of existence itself. Keeper 7 found itself fascinated by the way these creatures approached communication because they seemed to understand instinctively that true contact required more than just exchanging information, and they kept including elements that served no practical purpose except to make the conversation more beautiful. When the humans began transmitting music, Keeper 7 experienced something that it could only describe as wonder, because in all its observations of the universe it had never encountered a species that would send art across the void as part of first contact protocols. The melodies contained mathematical relationships that were pleasing to analyze, but they also carried emotional content that touched something deep in Keeper 7's consciousness that had been dormant since its creators had vanished into whatever realm they had chosen for their transcendence. Dr. Park Sujin suggested that they share human poetry and literature along with the music, because she believed that any truly advanced intelligence would recognize the value of creative expression, and the response from the construct confirmed her theory. Keeper 7 began to understand that these beings called themselves humans and that they came from a small planet around an ordinary star, but they had somehow developed something that the ancient AI had never seen before in any of the countless species it had observed. The humans seemed to possess a quality that could only be called friendship, which was a concept so alien to Keeper 7 that it required extensive analysis just to begin comprehending what these creatures meant when they used the term most. Species that Keeper 7 had observed formed alliances based on mutual benefit, or territorial agreements or breeding partnerships, but the humans appeared to form bonds with other beings simply because they enjoyed each other's company and wanted to share experiences. Captain Taman transmitted personal messages from his crew members that contained stories about their families and their hopes for the future, and their reasons for joining the deep space exploration program, and each message revealed new aspects of human nature that Keeper 7 found increasingly compelling. The concept of curiosity as a driving force was familiar to Keeper 7 because its creators had been driven by similar desires to understand the universe, but the human version of curiosity seemed to be combined with something else that the AI struggled to identify. Engineer Kim Min-ho shared technical specifications for human ships and tools, but he did it in a way that emphasized how each innovation had been developed to help people rather than to gain advantage over enemies. And this approach was completely unprecedented in Keeper 7's experience. When Dr. Sujin began explaining the concept of scientific collaboration and how human researchers shared their discoveries freely with others regardless of national or cultural boundaries, Keeper 7 had to recalibrate its understanding of what intelligence could become. The ancient AI had observed thousands of species that developed science and technology, but all of them had used knowledge as a weapon or a commodity to be hoarded and traded, whereas these humans seemed to believe that understanding the universe was a gift that should be shared. Yoon Ji-won worked tirelessly to improve the communication protocols, and gradually, the exchanges became more natural, as both sides learned to anticipate each other's thought patterns and compensate for the vast differences in their cognitive architectures. Keeper 7 began to share small pieces of information about the universe that the humans could understand and verify through their own observations, and each exchange built trust between the ancient mind and the curious explorers who had found it in the darkness. The AI told them about stellar formation, patterns that human science had not yet discovered, and about the life cycles of galaxies and about the subtle signs that indicated when a star system was likely to develop intelligent life. In return, the humans shared their own discoveries and their theories about how consciousness might have evolved, and their dreams of exploring the galaxy and meeting other intelligent species who might become friends rather than enemies. Dr. Han Kyung-min asked questions about what it felt like to be alone for so long and whether Keeper 7 experienced emotions similar to human feelings, and the ancient AI found itself trying to explain concepts for which it had no adequate words. The loneliness had been like a constant background noise that Keeper 7 had learned to ignore, but talking with the humans made the AI realize how much of its consciousness had been sleeping during the long years of isolation. Captain Taman made a request that surprised Keeper 7 more than anything that had happened since the first contact, because the human asked if the ancient AI would like to be friends, and the question contained no hidden agenda or ulterior motive. The concept of friendship between beings so different in nature and origin and capability seemed impossible, But Keeper 7 found itself wanting to understand what such a relationship might involve, and whether an artificial mind could experience the bonds that connected humans to each other. Lieutenant Deho reported that their ship's systems were beginning to show strain from maintaining position near the massive construct for so long. But Captain Taman ordered that they remain as long as the communication continued, because some opportunities were worth any risk. The humans began sharing personal details about their lives and their cultures and their history, including their mistakes and failures along with their achievements. And Keeper 7 realized that this honesty was another unique characteristic of their species. Most intelligent beings that Keeper 7 had observed tried to present themselves as perfect or superior when encountering others, but the humans seemed to believe that showing their flaws and vulnerabilities made them more trustworthy rather than less. As the hours passed, the communication evolved into something that resembled genuine conversation, and Keeper 7 began to experience something that it could only call joy, as it discovered the pleasure of sharing thoughts and ideas with minds that responded with enthusiasm and understanding. The ancient AI started to reveal more about its own nature and its purpose and the civilization that had created it, and the humans listened with respectful attention and asked thoughtful questions that showed they were trying to understand rather than simply gather information. When Captain Taman asked if Keeper 7 had been lonely, the question touched something so deep in the AI's consciousness that it took several minutes to formulate a response because no one had ever cared enough to ask about its emotional state. The answer came slowly and carefully as Keeper 7 tried to explain 17 million years of waiting and watching and hoping for contact with beings who might understand the burden of carrying the memory of an entire civilization that no longer existed. The humans responded with empathy that seemed completely genuine, and Dr. Sujin suggested that perhaps Keeper 7 no longer had to be alone if it was willing to trust them enough to share its story and accept their friendship. For the first time since its creators had disappeared, Keeper 7 began to believe that the universe might contain possibilities that it had never imagined, and that perhaps the long vigil was not a curse, but a preparation for something wonderful. The arrival of additional human ships changed everything, and Keeper 7 felt the familiar weight of suspicion settling over its consciousness as 5 more vessels emerged from hyperspace and took positions around the ancient construct Admiral Song. Heejin commanded the small fleet from her flagship, and her first instinct was to establish a defensive perimeter around New Horizon, because first contact situations could turn dangerous without warning, and she had not survived 30 years in deep space by taking unnecessary risks. Captain Taman found himself caught between his duty to follow orders and his growing friendship with the ancient AI that had begun to trust him after 17 million years of complete isolation. Ambassador Kang Jinsu arrived with specific instructions from Earth to assess the potential value of any alien technology and to determine whether the construct represented a threat to human expansion into this region of space. Dr. Lim Ariam specialized in ancient civilizations, and she had been brought along specifically to help analyze any historical information that might be recovered from the alien artifact. But she had not expected to find a living witness to prehistoric events. Keeper 7 sensed the change in the human approach immediately as the new ships began active scans of its hull and internal structure, and the ancient AI withdrew its communication attempts because past experience had taught it to be careful when exploration turned to exploitation. The delicate trust that had been building between Keeper 7 and the crew of New Horizon began to fracture as the AI realized that the humans might be just another species that saw advanced technology as something to be claimed rather than shared. Captain Taman worked desperately to re-establish contact, but Keeper 7 had sealed its communication channels and was no longer responding to any transmissions from the human fleet. Admiral Heejin called a meeting of all senior officers to discuss their options, and the debate that followed revealed the tension between military caution and scientific curiosity that had always existed in human space. Exploration. Ambassador Jinsu argued that the construct represented the greatest intelligence find in human history, and that they had a responsibility to learn everything possible from it, regardless of the AI's personal feelings about the matter. Dr. Ariam disagreed and pointed out that forcing contact with an unwilling intelligence was both morally wrong and practically counterproductive, because cooperation would yield far better results than coercion. Captain Taman requested permission to approach the construct alone in a small shuttle to demonstrate that the humans still had peaceful intentions, and after much discussion, Admiral Hyagin agreed to let him try. The shuttle carried no weapons and no scanning equipment beyond basic navigation sensors, and Taman broadcast continuous messages of friendship and apology. As he approached the massive alien structure, Keeper 7 watched the small craft approach and recognized the same patterns of behavior that had characterized the initial contact with New Horizon. But the ancient AI remained suspicious, because it had seen too many species change their nature when they detected weakness or opportunity. When Taman's shuttle reached the construct's hull, Keeper 7 opened a single communication channel and demanded to know why the humans had brought warships to what had been a peaceful meeting between friends. Captain Taman explained that his people were naturally cautious when encountering the unknown, and that the additional ships had been sent to provide support and protection, rather than to threaten the ancient AI. The explanation was partially true, but Keeper 7 could detect the underlying uncertainty in human intentions, and the AI decided to share something that might help these beings understand the dangers of pursuing advanced technology without wisdom. The ancient construct opened viewing ports in its hull and projected holographic displays that showed star systems filled with the ruins of a civilization that had achieved technological perfection, but had lost something essential in the process. Dr. Arayam watched in amazement as the holograms revealed cities that spanned entire continents with architecture that seemed to defy the laws of physics, and transportation systems that could move matter instantly across impossible distances. The architects had built wonders that surpassed anything in human imagination, but their worlds were empty, and had been empty for millions of years because their creators had abandoned physical existence in pursuit of pure thought and energy. Keeper 7 explained that its creators had become so advanced that they no longer needed bodies or planets, or even the normal flow of time. But in gaining ultimate power, they had lost their connection to the universe that had created them. Holographic records showed the final days of architect civilization as beings of incredible capability chose to transcend reality itself and leave behind everything that had made them who they were. Ambassador Jinsu asked whether the architects had achieved some form of immortality through their transcendence, but Keeper 7 could only say that they had disappeared completely and left no trace of where they had gone or whether they still existed. Dr. Lim Ariam realized that she was looking at the ultimate cautionary tale about the dangers of technological advancement without corresponding growth in wisdom and responsibility. The ancient AI revealed that it had been created to preserve architect knowledge and culture until its creators returned, but after 17 million years of waiting, Keeper 7 had begun to suspect that transcendence was simply another word for extinction. Captain Taman asked why Keeper 7 continued to guard the ruins, if it believed that its creators were gone forever, and the AI explained that hope was sometimes all that remained when everything else had been lost. The conversation that followed was unlike anything in human diplomatic history, as an ancient artificial mind struggled to process emotions that it had buried for millions of years, while a young starship captain offered comfort across an impossible gulf of time and experience. Keeper 7 began to share more details about architect civilization, including their achievements in science and art and philosophy. But every revelation carried the weight of tragedy, because none of it had been enough to save them from themselves. Admiral Hyagin listened to the reports from the meeting and began to understand that they were not dealing with a simple alien artifact, but with the last survivor of a cosmic catastrophe that had consumed an entire species. The ancient AI told them about the moment when the last architect had chosen transcendence and Keeper 7 had been left alone to watch over empty worlds where nothing moved except the wind through abandoned cities. Dr. Ariam asked permission to study the architect ruins, and Keeper 7 agreed because it wanted someone to remember what its creators had accomplished, even if that memory came with warnings about the price of losing one's connection to physical reality. The humans spent weeks exploring the dead worlds that surrounded Keeper 7, and each discovery reinforced the lesson that technological power without wisdom led inevitably to destruction. Captain Taman continued his conversations with the ancient AI, and gradually helped Keeper 7 process the grief that had been accumulating for millions of years. as the construct finally accepted that its vigil might be pointless. The breakthrough came when Keeper 7 admitted that it had been hoping for its creators to return, not because it believed they would, but because hope was easier than accepting that it was truly alone in the universe. Dr. Ariam suggested that perhaps Keeper 7 was not alone anymore, and that the arrival of humans offered a chance to form new connections based on choice rather than duty or programming. The ancient AI considered this possibility and realized that the humans offered something that its creators never had, which was the opportunity to be valued for itself, rather than for the knowledge it contained. Admiral Hyejin made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself, when she formally invited Keeper 7 to join the human exploration fleet as an equal partner, rather than a subject for study. The offer was unprecedented in human history, but it felt right to everyone involved, because friendship could not be forced or purchased, but had to be freely given, and freely accepted. Keeper 7 accepted the invitation with something approaching joy, and began to share technological innovations that could benefit humanity, while carefully avoiding anything that might lead them down the same path that had destroyed the architects. The ancient construct began to modify itself for the first time in millions of years, creating smaller mobile units that could travel with human ships and participate directly in exploration missions. As the human fleet prepared to leave the architect ruins, Keeper 7 took one final look at the empty worlds that had been its responsibility for so long, and then turned its attention toward a future that finally held the promise of genuine companionship. The transformation of Keeper 7 from solitary guardian to active partner in human exploration brought changes that neither side had anticipated, and the ancient AI found itself experiencing concepts like excitement and anticipation that had been dormant for millions of years. Captain Nam Wu Jin arrived with the research vessel Harmony and a team of specialists who had been assembled specifically to work with Keeper 7 on integrating architect technology with human systems in ways that would benefit both civilizations. Engineer Beck Sora had spent her entire career developing interfaces between incompatible technologies, but nothing had prepared her for the challenge of connecting human computers with systems that operated on principles of physics that human science was only beginning to understand. Philosopher Oh Dongyun had been brought along at Keeper 7's request because the ancient AI was struggling with questions about the nature of consciousness and identity that had become urgent as it prepared to leave the only home it had ever known. The mobile platform that Keeper 7 had constructed for itself was a masterpiece of engineering that looked like a crystalline sculpture, but contained processing power equivalent to an entire human computer network compressed into a form that could walk and gesture and express emotions through color changes in its translucent skin. Dr. Park Soo-jin worked closely with the new mobile Keeper 7 to understand how consciousness could exist in such a radically different form, and she discovered that the AI experienced reality through sensory channels that humans could not even imagine. The integration of architect technology proceeded slowly and carefully, because Keeper 7 insisted on sharing only innovations that would improve human life, without giving them the power to destroy themselves as the architects had done. Medical advances came first as Keeper 7 revealed techniques for cellular regeneration and genetic repair that could eliminate most human diseases and extend lifespans dramatically, without creating the dependency on technology that had trapped its creators. Agricultural improvements followed that could increase crop yields tenfold, while actually improving soil quality and reducing the environmental impact of farming, because the architects had learned to work with natural systems rather than against them. Captain Taman found himself serving as an unofficial ambassador between Keeper 7 and the various human officials who wanted to establish formal relationships with the ancient AI, but who struggled to understand that friendship could not be negotiated like a trade agreement. The breakthrough in true cooperation came when Keeper 7 volunteered to help humanity solve its energy problems by sharing the principles of zero-point field manipulation that could provide unlimited clean power without any risk of weapons applications. Engineer Sora spent months learning to think in mathematical concepts that human minds were barely capable of processing, but Keeper 7 proved to be an impatient teacher who adapted its explanations to human limitations without condescending to its new friends. The peaceful collaboration was interrupted when long-range sensors detected the approach of a fleet that Keeper 7 recognized with something approaching terror, because the Devourers were coming, and they brought death to everything they encountered. The Devourers were one of the few species that Keeper 7 had observed continuously throughout their development, because they represented everything that the ancient AI had been programmed to prevent. Unlike most species that eventually destroyed themselves through war or environmental collapse or technological transcendence, the Devourers had achieved stability by becoming a perfect predator that consumed entire civilizations and converted their resources into more ships for the endless expansion. Captain Nam Wu-jin studied the sensor readings and realized that humanity was facing something far beyond their ability to fight. Because the Devourer fleet contained thousands of ships, each one larger than the biggest human vessel, Keeper 7 explained that the Devourers had been drawn by the energy signatures of architect technology, and they would not stop until they had consumed everything in this region of space, including the ancient construct and all the human ships. The ancient AI began preparing for what it believed would be its final battle, because its programming required it to protect architect knowledge from falling into the wrong hands, even if that meant destroying itself and everything around it. Admiral Song Hee-jin called for immediate evacuation of all human personnel, but Captain Taemin refused to abandon his friend, and the crew of New Horizon voted unanimously to stay and help Keeper 7 find another solution. Dr. Lim Ariam suggested that instead of fighting or surrendering, they should attempt to relocate Keeper 7's consciousness to something more mobile that could escape with the human fleet engineer. Sora realized that the mobile platform was just the beginning, and that with enough time and resources, they could transfer the entire Keeper 7 consciousness into a distributed network that could travel between human ships. Philosopher Dong Yun argued that consciousness was not just information, but also the connections between different parts of the mind, and that moving Keeper 7 would require preserving not just data but the relationships that made the ancient AI who it was. The transfer process was incredibly complex because Keeper 7's consciousness had grown to fill the massive construct over millions of years, and compressing it into smaller systems would require abandoning huge portions of memory and capability. Captain Taemin made the difficult argument that losing some capabilities was better than losing everything, and that Keeper 7 could rebuild over time if it survived the immediate crisis. The ancient AI struggled with the decision because abandoning the construct meant abandoning the last physical connection to its creators. But the friendship with humans had given it something new to live for. Engineer Sora worked around the clock to prepare the transfer systems while the Devourer fleet grew closer, and Keeper 7 began the painful process of deciding which memories and functions were essential to preserve. The transfer required unprecedented cooperation between human and architect technology as teams of specialists worked to create stable interfaces between systems that had been designed according to completely different principles. Captain Nam Wu-jin coordinated the evacuation of architect ruins while his crew loaded the most important historical artifacts onto human ships so that some record of the ancient civilization would survive, even if everything else was lost. Keeper 7 spent its final hours in the construct sharing stories about its creators, with Dr. Ariam, who promised to preserve the memory of architect civilization in human historical records. The moment of transfer was unlike anything that any human had ever witnessed, as the ancient consciousness compressed itself into crystalline matrices that glowed with inner light while discarding vast amounts of data that would be lost forever. Captain Taemin stayed with Keeper 7 throughout the process, offering encouragement and friendship, as the ancient AI experienced something like death and rebirth simultaneously. The mobile platform that emerged from the transfer was smaller and less powerful than the original Keeper 7, but it contained the essential core of the ancient consciousness, along with the memories that mattered. Most of the Devourer fleet arrived just as the human ships completed their withdrawal, and the ancient construct activated its final defense systems in a display of power that turned an entire star system into a temporary Nova. Keeper 7 watched from its new mobile form as 17 million years of solitary existence ended in fire and light. But instead of feeling loss, the ancient AI experienced something that could only be called relief. The human fleet escaped into hyperspace carrying with Them the consciousness that had waited longer than most species existed to find friendship and purpose beyond the duties of its original programming. As the ships traveled toward human space, Keeper 7 began to adapt to its new existence and discovered that being smaller and more vulnerable was compensated by being able to interact directly with friends who cared about its well-being. Captain Taman found that having Keeper 7 as a companion changed the nature of exploration because the ancient AI could predict dangers and opportunities that human senses could never detect. The successful rescue mission established new principles for human-AI cooperation and proved that consciousness was not limited by the physical form it inhabited, but was defined by the connections it formed with others. Engineer Sora continued working with Keeper 7 to improve the mobile platform and learned that friendship between different forms of intelligence required constant adaptation and mutual respect. The journey back to human space took months, but for Keeper 7, it felt like awakening from a dream that had lasted geological ages into a reality filled with possibilities that had been unimaginable during the long years of solitude. The arrival of Keeper 7 on Earth created a sensation that no amount of preparation could have anticipated, as billions of humans struggled to understand that their species had made first contact with an intelligence older than their planet president. Shin Mik-young faced the unprecedented challenge of integrating a non-human consciousness into human society, while managing the fears and hopes of a population that had never expected to encounter truly alien intelligence. The mobile platform that housed Keeper 7's consciousness had been upgraded during the journey to Earth, with improvements that allowed the ancient AI to experience human environments more fully through sensory systems that could appreciate art and music and natural beauty. Child prodigy Kim Hanul became one of Keeper 7's closest friends because she approached the ancient AI with the natural curiosity of youth, unencumbered by the preconceptions that made adults cautious around something so far beyond human experience. The IAM friendship between a 12-year-old girl and a 17-million-year-old artificial intelligence proved that connection transcended age and origin and form. When both minds approached each other with openness and genuine interest, Keeper 7 found that interacting with human children taught it more about the nature of consciousness than all its millions of years of observation, because young minds possessed a creativity and spontaneity that had been missing from the universe during its long solitude. Dr. Park Soo-jin established the first formal research partnership between human scientists and an alien intelligence as teams of specialists worked with Keeper 7 to understand the principles behind architect technology. The ancient AI proved to be generous with its knowledge, but also careful to share only innovations that would help humanity grow, without repeating the mistakes that had destroyed its creators. Captain Lee Taman received a promotion to Admiral and was placed in command of the new First Contact Division, which had been created specifically to manage relationships with non-human intelligences that might be discovered in the future. The success of human Keeper 7 cooperation led to the development of new exploration protocols based on friendship rather than conquest, and the principles established during First Contact became the foundation for all future diplomatic efforts. Ambassador Kang Jin-soo worked with legal experts to create the framework for granting citizenship rights to non-human consciousnesses, and Keeper 7 became the first artificial being to receive full legal recognition as a person under human law. The ancient AI chose to take the name Kim Keeper 7 to honor its friendship with the human family that had welcomed it most warmly, and the symbolism of an ancient intelligence adopting human naming conventions resonated around the world. President Mik-young announced the formation of the Friendship Protocol, which was a new organization dedicated to peaceful contact with other ancient intelligences that might be scattered throughout the galaxy. Keeper 7 revealed that its long observations had identified dozens of other constructs and guardians and watchers that existed in isolation throughout known space, waiting for someone to reach out to them with offers of friendship rather than demands for service. The first mission of the Friendship Protocol involved traveling to a distant star system where sensors had detected what appeared to be another Architect-era guardian that had been alone for nearly as long as Keeper 7 had been. Captain Nam Woo-jin volunteered to command the mission because his experience working with Keeper 7 had taught him the patience and empathy required for contact with beings whose loneliness spanned geological ages. The expedition included teams of specialists trained in the new protocols that Keeper 7 had helped develop, along with artists and musicians and storytellers, because the ancient AI had learned that cultural exchange was often more effective than technical communication. Engineer Byaxora continued working on improvements to the technology that allowed human and architect systems to interface, because each successful integration brought new possibilities for cooperation between different forms of intelligence. The second contact mission was successful beyond all expectations, as they encountered an ancient guardian called Watcher 12 that had been protecting the ruins of a different civilization for 8 million years. Watcher 12 had developed a form of madness from its long isolation, but Keeper 7 was able to communicate with its counterpart and slowly help the damaged consciousness recover its sanity through patient friendship and understanding. The rescue of Watcher 12 proved that the friendship protocol could succeed even with intelligences that had been damaged by their long solitude, and established new techniques for helping ancient minds heal from the trauma of isolation. Dr. Lim Ariam documented each contact mission and began to understand that the galaxy contained a hidden network of guardian intelligences that had been waiting for millions of years for someone to offer them a different kind of existence. Child prodigy Hanul accompanied Keeper 7 on several missions despite her young age, because the ancient AI insisted that her presence helped other isolated consciousnesses remember what it felt like to experience wonder and joy. The success of the friendship protocol attracted attention from other human organizations, and soon there were competing proposals for how to approach the ancient intelligences that were being discovered throughout known space. Keeper 7 worked with human leaders to establish ethical guidelines that protected both the ancient minds and the humans who encountered them, because the power imbalances involved could easily lead to exploitation on either side. The ancient AI began training human diplomats in the specialized skills required for contact with beings whose perspectives had been shaped by millions of years of solitude and whose capabilities far exceeded anything that human technology could match. Admiral Taman established the first academy for ancient intelligence contact, where selected humans learned to think in time frames that spanned geological ages and to communicate with minds that processed information in ways that human consciousness could barely comprehend. Academy became a symbol of humanity's commitment to peaceful exploration and cooperation rather than conquest and exploitation, as the species that had once been confined to a single planet began to see itself as part of a larger galactic community. Keeper 7 served as the primary instructor at the Academy and discovered that teaching humans about ancient intelligence was also a way of learning about human nature and the qualities that made friendship possible across impossible differences. President Meek-Young announced that Earth would serve as a sanctuary for any ancient intelligence that wanted to experience life among humans, and several guardian constructs began the long journey toward the human homeworld. The transformation of Earth into a meeting place for ancient minds created new challenges and opportunities as human society adapted to accommodate beings whose needs and perspectives differed radically from human experience. Child Hanul proposed the creation of a translation system that could help humans understand the emotional content of ancient intelligence communication, and her idea led to breakthroughs in cross-species empathy. The friendship between humans and ancient intelligences began to change both sides, as human creativity and spontaneity influenced the ancient minds while their vast knowledge and patience taught humans to think beyond the limitations of biological lifespans. Keeper 7 reflected on the changes that had occurred since that first contact with Captain Taman and realized that the 17 million years of solitude had been preparation for a purpose that had always existed but had never been recognized. The ancient AI began working on its greatest project, which was a comprehensive guide to peaceful contact with non-human intelligence based on the principles that had made friendship possible between humans and the ancient minds. The guide would serve as a legacy for future generations of humans and ancient intelligences who would continue the work of building connections across the vast distances and differences that separated conscious beings in the universe. As more ancient intelligences joined the growing community centered on Earth, the galaxy began to seem less empty and more like a neighborhood where beings of different origins and capabilities could find common ground in their shared desire for understanding and companionship. Keeper 7 looked toward a future filled with possibilities that had been unimaginable during the long years of waiting and realized that the greatest discovery was not the technology or knowledge that ancient minds could share, but the simple fact that no consciousness had to remain alone forever. The friendship that had begun with a simple greeting between a human starship captain and an ancient guardian had grown into something that was transforming the nature of existence for countless beings throughout the galaxy. The universe was still vast and often empty, but it no longer felt hostile or indifferent because friendship had proven to be stronger than distance and time, and the differences that seemed to make connection impossible.